When people talk about House of the Dragon, the politics get all the attention at first. But if you've actually sat through the show, you know the real stars have always been the dragons. So today we're going through all 17 dragons that have appeared on the show so far. Starting things off at number 17 is Grey Ghost, one of the 3 wild dragons that made their home in the caves of Dragonstone alongside Sheepstealer and the much more famous Cannibal. Grey Ghost earned his name from his pale, smoky coloring and his habit of staying elusive, rarely seen by small folk, and never claimed by any rider despite multiple dragon seeds trying to track him down during the desperate search for new dragon riders in the back half of the dance. That elusiveness is part of what made him such a tempting prize for desperate dragon seeds, even as it ultimately kept him out of their reach entirely. Unlike Sheepstealer, who developed a reputation for raiding livestock, Grey Ghost preferred fishing the narrow sea for his meals, swooping low over the water to snatch up prey rather than terrorizing farms. That diet and lifestyle tell you something important about where he sits in terms of raw power, because a dragon living off fish is not the same kind of apex predator as one that has spent years locked in actual combat. His end came quietly and violently all at once, killed in a clash above the dragon mount that was initially blamed on the Cannibal, before the truth came out that it was actually Sunfyre who tore him apart. At number 16, we have Arrax, the dragon bonded to Balerion. If you watched Season 1, you already know exactly why this one sits low. Arrax was young, lean, and pale, built for speed rather than brute force, which made sense for a dragon who hatched at around the same time as his rider and grew up alongside him rather than being claimed later in life. The tragedy of Arrax is that his story is forever defined by that storm over Storm's End, when Vhagar appeared out of the clouds and made it brutally clear just how far apart these two dragons were in terms of raw size and power. Arrax was estimated to be roughly a fifth the size of Vhagar in that confrontation, and even with his speed and agility working in his favor, that gap was simply too large to overcome once Aemon lost control and let Vhagar's instincts take over. That scene haunts the entire back half of the war, because it's the spark that turns a political standoff into an actual shooting conflict, and it shows exactly why size discrepancies between dragons are not something a rider can simply skill their way around. Arrax never got the chance to grow into anything more. He was cut down in his youth, but his death changed the entire trajectory of the story, which counts for something even if his combat power never got the chance to develop. It's a sobering reminder that in this world, potential alone counts for very little once a larger predator decides to act. Up next, number 15 is Vermax, the dragon belonging to Valerion, Lucerys' older brother. Vermax has the advantage of simply having more time on his side compared to Arrax, since Fire and Blood tells us this dragon kept growing larger with each passing year, putting him a clear step ahead of his younger sibling's dragon by the time the war actually breaks out. We see Vermax used for diplomacy more than combat early on, carrying Jacaerys across Westeros to rally the North and the Vale to Rhaenyra's cause. This says less about combat power and more about trust and reliability as a long-distance flyer. That said, do not mistake Vermax for some harmless courier dragon. By the time the war reaches its bloodiest stretches, he's matured into a genuinely formidable beast capable of holding his own in the kind of aerial skirmishes that define this conflict. He still falls short of the true heavyweights on this list simply because he has not had the decades that older generations of dragons enjoyed. But among the younger crop hatched specifically for Rhaenyra's children, Vermax stands out as the one with the real upward trajectory. He's a dragon who was still very much on the rise when the story catches up with him. And there's a real argument that, given more time, he could have climbed even higher on a list like this one. Sitting at number 14, we have Tessarion, known in the books as the Blue Queen for her striking cobalt scales and copper-colored wings, claws, and crest. Tessarion belongs to Daeron Targaryen, the youngest of Alicent's children. For most of the show so far, she's existed almost entirely off-screen, tucked away in Old Town while her rider grows into someone capable of actually controlling her in battle. When we finally do get a glimpse of her soaring above the Hightower army, it is brief, but it's enough to confirm what the lore has been telling us all along, that this is a nimble, fast-moving dragon, built more for precision strikes than for the kind of brute force slugging matches that dragons like Vhagar specialize in. By the time the dance reaches its later stages in the books, Tessarion has grown to roughly a third the size of Vermithor, which puts her solidly in the mid-tier rather than down with the true juveniles. And her aerial combat record during the war ends up being genuinely impressive, given how late she enters the fight. Coming in next at number 13 is Sheepstealer, another of the wild Dragonstone trio. Described in the source material as skinny rather than bulky, Sheepstealer nonetheless represents a genuine threat, because wild dragons that grow up outside the structure of the dragon pits tend to develop differently than their domesticated cousins. They often end up larger and more dangerous precisely because nothing has constrained their growth. His reputation among the small folk comes from his habit of raiding the countryside for livestock, snatching sheep and the occasional unlucky sheepdog right off the hillsides of Dragonstone and the Vale, which is exactly the kind of behavior that tells you this is not a docile, trainable creature like the dragons bonded to Targaryen royalty from birth. Sheepstealer later bonds with Rhaena Targaryen, but is still a wild card as she cannot fully control him yet, and that unpredictability is exactly what makes the pairing so tense to watch unfold. At number 12, we have Moondancer, the dragon of Baela Targaryen. You might be surprised she appears higher on this list, but strength isn't purely about size. Moondancer never grew into one of the massive dragons in Westeros. In the books, she's explicitly described as never growing larger than a horse, which by Targaryen dragon standards is genuinely tiny. But here is where speed and skill completely override raw bulk. Moondancer is consistently shown and described as one of the fastest, most agile flyers in the entire war. She's capable of outmaneuvering dragons that dwarf her in size. The show has leaned into this by giving her a confrontation with Sunfyre, a dragon considerably larger than her, and having her come out on top through sheer maneuverability rather than brute force. Baela herself deserves credit here too, since she's fearless and sharp, willing to push Moondancer into situations that a more cautious rider would avoid, and that aggressive partnership is exactly what allows a smaller dragon to punch so far above her actual size. Coming in at number 11 is Dreamfyre, the dragon bonded to Helaena Targaryen, and one of the more tragic, underutilized presences on this entire list. Dreamfyre is the second oldest living dragon in the story behind Vhagar. The problem for Dreamfyre has never been capability, it's been opportunity. Helaena is a gentle soul who has shown no real interest in unleashing her dragon on the battlefield. So this pale, slender creature with her distinctive blue and silver coloring has spent most of the war sitting underused in the dragon pit, while younger, less experienced dragons get thrown into the fighting instead. Fire and Blood makes it clear that despite her age and her impressive lineage, Dreamfyre has simply never seen real combat. This creates this strange situation where she could possibly be one of the most dangerous creatures in Westeros, and we genuinely don't know because nobody has tested her. There's also the matter of her own offspring being involved in the war, since Dreamfyre is the mother of several of the younger dragons running around in this conflict. This only adds another layer to how central she actually is to the bloodline, even while staying out of the action herself. If Helaena ever changes her mind, or if circumstances force her hand, Dreamfyre has the size and the age to immediately become one of the biggest threats in the sky. At number 10, we have Silverwing. This is a dragon whose reputation comes almost entirely from her history rather than anything flashy she's done on screen so far. Silverwing was the mount of Queen Alysanne Targaryen, sister and wife to Jaehaerys I. She carried Alysanne the length and breadth of Westeros during her life, famously flying her queen all the way north to the Wall itself, though notably, she refused to actually cross beyond it. After Alysanne's death, Silverwing relocated to Dragonstone alongside Vermithor. There, the two of them lived out their years without riders until the desperate circumstances of the war pushed Rhaenyra's faction to go looking for anyone bold enough to claim the old riderless dragon sitting unused. In the show, that ends up being Ulf, a claim that comes with plenty of question marks, given his shaky claims about his own parentage. But regardless of who ends up in the saddle, Silverwing's size and her decades of accumulated age put her firmly in the upper tier of dragons still living during this war. A dragon with that much history behind her does not simply lose her edge because she spent years without a rider on her back. Up next at number 9 is Sunfyre. Now this is where things start getting genuinely controversial among fans, because depending on which moment of the story you're looking at, Sunfyre's reputation swings wildly. Aegon's dragon is widely regarded as the most beautiful creature in the entire history of the Targaryen bloodline. She has scales of true gold that catch the light in a way no other dragon in the story can match. But beauty is not the same as combat readiness, and early on, Sunfyre suffers from the same problem a lot of dragons share, an inexperienced rider in Aegon, who has neither the temperament nor the discipline to use his dragon's strengths effectively. That all changes violently at the Battle of Rook's Rest, when Sunfyre goes up against Meleys and the fight leaves both combatants devastated, with Sunfyre and Aegon both left clinging to life in the aftermath. Here's the twist that a lot of casual viewers miss though, because in the books, Sunfyre actually survives that encounter and continues fighting afterward. He eventually accumulates enough battle scars and combat experience that by later stages of the dance, he's considered to have surpassed even Vhagar in terms of how battle-hardened he has become. It's a genuine redemption arc, but so far, the show hasn't done much to show us that part. Hopefully future seasons give this dragon the spotlight his book counterpart actually earns. At number 8, we have Seasmoke, the dragon originally bonded to Laenor Balerion. This is a dragon whose strength comes almost entirely from lived experience rather than raw size. Seasmoke is on the smaller side compared to the true giants further up this list, pale silver-gray in coloring, built for nimbleness rather than overwhelming bulk, but what he lacks in size, he more than makes up for in actual combat resume. Seasmoke fought in the Stepstones campaign against the Triarchy alongside Caraxes, giving him real war experience years before the dance even begins. This already separates him from a lot of the younger dragons who have never seen a real battlefield. After Laenor's stage death and disappearance, Seasmoke spends years without a rider. He grows restless and eventually finds his way to Adam of Hull, Corlys' bastard son. It's one of the more memorable rider-claiming scenes the show has given us, with the dragon actively seeking Adam out rather than waiting around to be approached. According to Fire and Blood, Seasmoke goes on to change the course of the war a second time when Adam moves to reclaim the city of Tumbleton from traitor forces. Though that same engagement ends in tragedy, when a riderless, enraged Vermithor catches up to him and kills him despite Seasmoke fighting with everything he has. He may not have the size to throw around, but few dragons in Westeros packed in as much actual relevant combat experience into their lifespan as Seasmoke did. Coming in at number 7 is Syrax, Rhaenyra's own dragon. A lot of fans might not agree with how high we placed her on this list, but anyone who actually knows the lore understands why she belongs this high. Syrax is a large yellow-scaled dragon who has spent decades by Rhaenyra's side. She's old enough and big enough that she's never needed to prove herself in the same desperate way some of the younger dragons have. Her size alone puts her in serious contention near the top of the food chain. And while the show has been careful about not throwing its lead character directly into the most violent dragon-on-dragon combat the way it does with side characters, that restraint is a political choice from Rhaenyra, rather than any actual limitation on what Syrax is capable of. We see her presence alone shift the balance of power in King's Landing after Viserys' death, when Rhaenyra uses Syrax as a show of force to help secure her position against Alicent's faction. This proves that sometimes a dragon's greatest weapon is simply existing as a credible threat. Syrax represents stability and seniority rather than flashy combat feats. She's the dragon equivalent of a queen who does not need to fight every battle personally, because her mere presence already changes the calculation for everyone around her. At number 6, we have Meleys, known across Westeros as the Red Queen. And if you ask a lot of fans, this dragon deserves to be ranked even higher than this. Meleys was already decades old by the time King Viserys was even born, which puts her firmly in the same generational tier as legends like Vhagar and Caraxes. And the histories of Westeros are explicit that during the reign of Jaehaerys I, Meleys was considered to have outpaced both of those dragons in terms of raw capability. Ridden by Rhaenys Targaryen, the woman fans still call the Queen Who Never Was, Meleys becomes one of the emotional and tactical centerpieces of the entire war, and her death at the Battle of Rook's Rest stands as one of the most devastating moments the show has produced. What makes the battle so significant from a power ranking perspective is who she actually fights, because Meleys does not go down easily or to some random lesser dragon. She goes down only after a brutal three-way clash involving both Sunfyre and ultimately Vhagar herself, the single strongest dragon alive during this entire era. Taking that kind of firepower to bring down, even in a fight she ultimately loses, tells you everything about how dangerous Meleys actually was. And Rhaenys riding her into that fight with full knowledge of the odds remains one of the most quietly heroic moments in the entire story. Few characters in this show go out with that much sheer defiance intact. Up next at number 5 is Caraxes, the Bloodworm. There's no way to talk about this dragon without immediately picturing Daemon Targaryen. The two of them are as close to inseparable as any rider and dragon pairing in the entire show. Caraxes has a genuinely unique look among the dragons we've seen, with that long serpentine neck and deep red scales that make him instantly recognizable even from a distance. His age stretches back far enough that he was already big enough to ride decades before the events of the dance began. This puts his true age somewhere in the range of 60 to 70 years by the time the war kicks off. He cut his teeth during the War for the Stepstones, tearing through the Triarchy's forces alongside Daemon in some of the most purely satisfying action the show has given us in its first season. But the single defining moment for Caraxes is the fight that finally brings down Vhagar herself. Daemon uses Caraxes' superior speed and agility to repeatedly outmaneuver the much larger, much older Vhagar, eventually locking both dragons into a death spiral that ends with Daemon killing Vhagar's rider and both dragons crashing to their doom together. That willingness from Caraxes to follow Daemon into a fight that was effectively a suicide mission against a dragon that outsized him so dramatically, and to actually succeed in bringing her down, is one of the most consequential single moments in the entire war. At number 4, we have Vermithor, the Bronze Fury. This is the dragon that almost nobody talks about enough, given just how genuinely terrifying he actually is. Vermithor was once the mount of King Jaehaerys Targaryen, the same king remembered as the wisest and most successful ruler the Targaryens ever produced. By the time the dance arrives, Vermithor is nearly a century old, making him one of the oldest and largest dragons still alive. second in scale only to Vhagar herself. For years, he has sat riderless on Dragonstone, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to actually approach him. That someone ends up being Hugh Hammer, a blacksmith with Targaryen blood running through his veins from generations back. And the moment Hugh successfully claims Vermithor represents one of the single biggest shifts in momentum the entire war produces, instantly handing Rhaenyra's faction a weapon capable of standing toe-to-toe with anything the Greens can throw at them. We get brutal proof of exactly how dangerous Vermithor is when, left riderless and enraged after a separate engagement, he catches up to Seasmoke during the fighting around Tumbleton and simply tears him apart, despite Seasmoke fighting back with everything he has. Vermithor does not need flashy choreography to prove his point. His sheer size, age, and accumulated power speak for themselves every single time he actually gets involved in the fighting. At number 3, we have Vhagar. She's the last living dragon to have actually flown during Aegon's conquest itself, which makes her old enough to have fought alongside Balerion the Black Dread during the original founding of the Targaryen dynasty in Westeros. She was first ridden by Queen Visenya, one of the 3 Targaryen siblings who conquered the 7 kingdoms together. By the time we meet her in House of the Dragon, she has had well over a century to grow into proportions that genuinely rival Balerion at the height of his power. This makes her the largest living dragon left in the entire world by the time the dance breaks out. The manner in which Aemon claims her, by climbing onto her back as a child despite the fact that she had already belonged to Laena Velaryon, and losing an eye in the chaos that follows when Lucerys attacks him for it, only adds to the sense that this is a dragon whose raw presence inspires both terror and obsession in equal measure. Once Aemon fully grows into a fully capable rider, Vhagar becomes an instrument of pure devastation. She effortlessly kills both Arrax and his young rider Lucerys in that fateful storm above Storm's End, with what amounts to barely any effort at all. Later, she plays a decisive role in the brutal 3-dragon engagement that claims Meleys and Rhaenys at Rook's Rest. Her size does come with one real drawback that lore is careful to point out. All that bulk makes her noticeably slower in the air than younger, more nimble dragons. This is precisely the weakness Daemon and Caraxes eventually exploit to finally bring her down. But for the overwhelming majority of this war, nothing among the living dragons has been able to match her raw destructive power, which is exactly why she still holds her place this high on the list. At number 2 is the Cannibal, black as coal with eyes the color of poison. The Cannibal is the largest and oldest of the 3 wild Dragonstone dragons. Some accounts in the lore even suggest he predates the Targaryens' arrival on the island entirely, which would make him older than Vhagar herself if true. His name comes from his horrifying habit of feeding on other dragons, devouring eggs, hatchlings, and even the corpses of grown dragons when the opportunity presents itself. Nobody has ever sat astride this creature, and nobody seems to want to try. There's a real possibility, floated by some maesters and dragon keepers in the source material, that the Cannibal is not even from the same bloodline as the other Targaryen dragons at all. This would explain his open hostility toward his own kind. Whatever the truth of his origins, the sheer fact that no one has ever dared to attempt to claim him tells you everything about the reputation he carries. It's exactly that unchecked, untamed nature that pushes him ahead of even Vhagar on this ranking. And that brings us finally to number 1, the single most dangerous dragon that has ever existed in this entire universe, Balerion the Black Dread. Balerion was Aegon the Conqueror's own mount during the conquest itself. He, alongside Vhagar and Caraxes, burned the Field of Fire and forged the 7 kingdoms into one. He went on to be ridden by King Maegor the Cruel and later by Prince Viserys. By the time he finally died of old age during the reign of Jaehaerys I, he was over 200 years old, the longest-lived dragon in Targaryen history. Every single account of Balerion agrees on one thing. He was the largest dragon to ever exist, full stop. His jaws were said to be large enough to swallow an Arrax whole. His teeth were as long as swords, and his wingspan was so vast that his shadow alone could swallow entire towns when he passed overhead. His fire burned black, sometimes streaked with red, and at the height of his power, it was hot enough to melt steel and fuse sand into glass. Even Vhagar, who grew larger than every other dragon still alive during the dance, never matched Balerion at his absolute peak. That gap in scale is exactly why the show treats his skull, still sitting in the cellars beneath the Red Keep long after his death, as such a haunting visual reminder of what Targaryen power used to look like. Nothing that flies during the War of the Stepstones or the Dance of the Dragons comes remotely close to what Balerion represented in his prime. Check out our next video on every dragon and dragon rider in House of the Dragon.